He changed the locks on a Tuesday, had her name removed from every account by Wednesday, and by Friday he brought her home. Birchwood Drive, Columbus, Ohio, the kind of street where the lawns are always cut, the driveways always clean, the kind of street where you wave at your neighbors on Saturday mornings and tell yourself you know what is happening behind their doors, but you don't. And that is the thing about streets like Birchwood Drive. They are designed to look like nothing could ever go wrong there. The houses are too nice. The trees are too perfectly placed. The families inside them too well dressed and too well spoken for anything truly dark to be happening behind those doors. But darkness does not care about the neighborhood it chooses. It does not care about the zip code or the lawn or the two-car garage. It moves into beautiful houses just as easily as it moves anywhere else. And sometimes it moves in wearing a tailored suit and a gold watch and a smile that the whole city knows. To everyone who knew David Whitfield, he was the American dream made flesh. The house, the business, the beautiful wife, the reputation. He shook hands like he meant it, smiled like he had earned it, remembered everyone's name, asked about their kids, showed up at the right events, said the right things to the right people at exactly the right moments. And for a long time, for a very long time, most people believed every single bit of it. To look at them at a dinner party, laughing, leaning into each other, two people who had clearly built something real together, you would never have suspected a thing. You would have looked at them and thought, there it is. There is what it looks like when two people actually make it work. And that is exactly what he was counting on. That is exactly the image he had spent years carefully constructing and maintaining. Because David Whitfield understood better than almost anyone that perception is its own kind of power, and if you can control what people see, you can control what people believe. And if you can control what people believe, you can do almost anything you want in the spaces they are not looking. But behind that front door, behind that smile, behind the charity galas and the magazine profiles and the handshakes and the confidence, David Whitfield had already made a decision. He had decided his wife was replaceable, and she knew it. She just was not ready to let him know that she knew. And that small gap between what she knew and what he thought she knew, that is where this entire story lives. Tonight we are going inside a true story about one of the most calculated cases of marital financial fraud ever documented in an American courtroom. This did not happen in a dark alley, did not happen in some distant city you will never visit. It happened in a neighborhood that looks exactly like yours, on a street where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and go to church on Sundays, where a man and a woman built something together for 19 years, sacrificed together, struggled together, succeeded together, and where one of them decided quietly, carefully, patiently, and over a very long time, to take it all, to restructure it, and rename it, and reroute it until the woman who had built half of everything had her name on none of it, and to do it so carefully, so methodically, so wrapped in the language of legitimate business practice, that by the time anyone looked closely enough to see what had actually happened, he believed it would be too late for anyone to do anything about it. He was wrong. This is a story about financial manipulation so calculated, so deliberately constructed, that when investigators finally saw the full picture, one of them said, "I have been doing this for 20 years, and I have never seen paperwork this clean used to do something this dirty." It is a story about a woman who helped build everything her husband had, who designed the financial architecture of their entire life together, who understood every LLC, every account, every asset, every liability, who was so deeply embedded in the structural foundation of their shared empire that removing her should have been impossible, and who one day to the outside world simply vanished. No police report, no missing persons bulletin, no public statement, just a chair pushed back from a dining table, a car still sitting in the driveway, a closet with her clothes still hanging on one side, and a husband who told anyone who asked. She chose to leave. It was mutual. We are handling it privately like adults. What David Whitfield did not understand, what men like David Whitfield never understand, is this: the most dangerous person in your life is not the one making noise. It is the one who goes completely quiet. It is the one who stops arguing, stops demanding, stops reacting, and simply starts watching, starts documenting, starts building something in the silence you created. Something you will not see coming because you were too busy congratulating yourself on how easily she seemed to disappear. Stay with me because nothing about this story is what it looks like, and I promise you by the time we get to the end you will understand exactly why. To understand what happened to Karen Whitfield, you have to go back much further than the moment everything collapsed. You have to go back to the beginning, to who Karen was before any of this, before the marriage, before the business, before David. Because Karen Whitfield did not become a formidable woman when the trouble started, she was already one. She had always been one. The trouble just gave her a reason to show it. Karen grew up in Dayton, Ohio, third of 4 children in a working family that understood the value of everything because they had always had to count it carefully. Her father ran a small construction company. Nothing glamorous, nothing that made the papers. Just honest work done well by a man who knew that reputation was the only currency that compounded over time. Her mother kept the books, every invoice, every payroll, every tax filing, every quarterly report, and she did it with a precision that Karen watched from the time she was old enough to climb onto a chair at the kitchen table and peer over the edge at the columns of numbers her mother moved through like a language she had been born speaking. Karen absorbed all of it. She absorbed the discipline of her father and the precision of her mother, and she combined them into something that was entirely her own, an instinct for financial structure that was almost physical in the way it worked. She did not just understand numbers, she felt them. She understood intuitively when something was off, when a column was carrying weight it should not be carrying, when an asset was positioned in a way that served someone's interest that was not immediately visible on the page. Her sister Susan once described her this way. She said Karen was the smartest person in every room she was ever in. She just never needed anyone to know that. That was Karen. She was never performing intelligence. She was just using it, quietly, constantly, in service of whatever she was building at the time. She let the work speak, and the work always spoke very clearly. By her late 20s, Karen had a degree in accounting from the University of Dayton, a sharp instinct for property valuation that she had developed working part-time for a commercial real estate assessor during her final 2 years of school, and a reputation in Columbus real estate circles as the person you brought in when the numbers were not adding up, when a deal had been structured in a way that looked clean on the surface but felt wrong underneath, when you needed someone who could read a financial document not just for what it said, but for what it was designed to conceal. She was that person, and she was known for it. She was not looking for a partner. She was building a life. She had her own clients, her own reputation, her own trajectory, and she was satisfied with where it was going. And then David Whitfield walked through the door of a Columbus commercial real estate networking event in the spring of 2000, and Karen, just this once, looked up from the numbers. David Whitfield was the kind of man who could sell you something before you knew you wanted it. Charismatic, magnetic, the kind of presence that fills a room without appearing to try, the kind of man who could make a room full of strangers feel like they had just been invited to something exclusive simply by the way he walked into it. He had grown up in Columbus, middle class, the son of a postal worker and a school administrator. And from an early age he had understood that the world responded to confidence the way flowers respond to sunlight. You point it in the right direction. You hold it steady, and things grow. 3 jobs before he was 22, a sales position at a commercial real estate firm by 25, and a reputation, earned genuinely at least in those early years, for closing deals that other people could not get close to because they did not have what David had, which was the ability to make the person across the table feel like agreeing with him was their own idea. A colleague of his from those early years told me, David could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 45 minutes later with 3 investors, 2 referrals, and someone's personal phone number. That was just his gift. You liked him before you had a reason to. But here is what people who worked closely with David noticed if they were paying attention carefully enough. The deals he closed brilliantly, the follow-through. Behind those deals, the operations, the documentation, the financing structures, the tax strategy, the compliance, the long-form execution that turns a good deal into a profitable one over time. Those always seemed to belong to someone else. David was exceptional at starting things and exceptional at closing things. But the middle, the long-sustained technical middle where real businesses are actually built, that was not his natural territory. David was the lightning. He needed someone to be the ground. And when he met Karen at that networking event in the spring of 2000, he found his ground. They married in September of 2001 after 14 months of courtship that people who knew them describe as genuinely romantic. David was attentive in those early years, curious about Karen's work, respectful of her expertise. quick to defer to her judgment on the financial side of things in a way that felt then like partnership and would later feel like something else entirely. They honeymooned. In Italy, they came home and immediately started building. And for the first several years, by every account from everyone who knew them, it worked. It really truly worked in the way that the best partnerships work. Karen ran the numbers. David closed the deals. Karen structured the LLCs. David filled them with clients. Karen managed the tax strategy and the financing and the compliance and the operational systems. David showed up at the events and the conferences and the dinners and brought home the opportunities that Karen then turned into actual sustainable revenue. Together, they took Whitfield Property Group from a $40,000 startup operating out of the second bedroom of their Clintonville apartment into a mid-sized firm with 14 active listings, 3 commercial properties generating consistent monthly revenue, and a reputation in Columbus real estate circles as a company that was run well, that delivered what it promised, and that understood both the creative and the technical sides of the business with equal competence. They were a team, a real one, the kind that people point to and say that is how it is supposed to work. That is what it looks like when two people bring genuinely different skills to the same table and respect each other enough to let those differences create something neither of them could have built alone. Their daughter Maya was born in 2012, and by all accounts the early years of her life were happy ones. Family vacations, school events, the rhythms of a successful upper-middle-class life in a beautiful house on a beautiful street in a city that had embraced them both. Karen was active in Maya's school, coached her soccer team for 2 seasons, was known in their neighborhood as the organized one, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, the one who brought food when someone was sick, the one who showed up always without being asked, because that is who Karen was. She showed up, she did the work, she did not need the credit. She was the spine, and she understood that the spine does not need to be seen to be essential, but here is what almost nobody outside their marriage understood. Karen was not a supporting player in that business. She was not the back office to David's front office. She was not the administrator to his visionary. She was its architecture. She had personally designed every LLC formation, every financing structure, every tax strategy, every risk model, every operational system that kept Whitfield Property Group functioning day after day and year after year. There was not a single financial decision of any significance in the 14-year history of that company that Karen had not either made herself or reviewed and approved before it was executed. The business existed in the shape it existed in because of decisions Karen had made, and the revenue it generated was sustainable because of systems Karen had built. David was the face, an excellent face, a necessary face, but a face nonetheless. And Karen was the spine. And as with all spines, the health of the entire structure depended on it even. Though nobody ever looked at it and said, "Thank you for being there. We see you. We know what you are holding up." Susan told me. She used to joke about that. She would say, "I am the spine, Sue. Nobody sees the spine." And I would laugh because it was funny the way she said it. But at some point, and I cannot tell you exactly when it changed, she stopped saying it like it was funny. She said the same words, but something in the tone was different. Something had shifted, and I think now looking back, that it shifted around the time David started to believe the joke was actually the truth, that he was the whole person and she was just a supporting character in his story. By 2015, 14 years into their marriage, something had quietly but unmistakably begun to shift in David Whitfield, and the people around him who were paying attention saw it even if they did not have the language for it at the time. He had started attending larger industry conferences, national ones. He had started speaking on panels. His name had begun appearing in Columbus business publications in a way it had not before. Profiles, features, a Businessman of the Year nomination from a local chamber of commerce, a growing public identity that had his name on the byline, and only his name. And with each new piece of recognition, each new room of important people who responded to his name with a nod of acknowledgement, something was happening inside David Whitfield that is not uncommon in men who have achieved a certain level of visible success. He was beginning to separate the performance of success from its actual source. He was beginning to look at the life he had and see only the parts he had personally touched, the deals he had personally closed, the rooms he had personally filled with his presence and his charm and his name. Slowly, without ever saying it out loud, David Whitfield had started to believe that the face was the whole person, and somewhere in that belief, Somewhere in the gap between what he had actually built and what he had come to believe he had built, he had started asking himself a question, a quiet question, a dangerous question, a question that should have stayed permanently unasked. And the question was this: what would all of this look like without her? What would my life look like? What would my company look like? What would my future look like if Karen were simply not in it? What would David Whitfield look like if the spine were gone and there were nothing left but the face? And the answer he arrived at sitting in his home office late at night, scrolling through the profiles of other men who had built things and were celebrated for it, was that it would look the same. It would look exactly the same. Because in his telling of the story, by that point she had already disappeared. She had already been edited out. And now all that remained was the administrative task of making the edit official. The answer to that question would cost him everything, but not before it cost Karen far more. Her name was Nicole Reeves, 34 years old, when she joined Whitfield Property Group in the spring of 2017 as a marketing coordinator. She had come recommended by a colleague of David's from a Cincinnati conference. She had a background in digital marketing and property photography, and she was by all genuine accounts, from people who worked with her, good at her job, professional, organized, creative in the specific ways that the job required. She did the work she was hired to do, and she did it well, and there was in those early months nothing that the people around her could point to and say, there it is. That is the thing that is going to change everything. It happened slowly, the way things that change everything usually happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small, unremarkable ones. A coffee that ran a little long, a conversation after a meeting that the rest of the team was not part of, a gradual reorientation of the office's center of gravity that was subtle enough that by the time people noticed, it had already been happening for months. A former employee who asked not to be named told me, "You would notice small things first." He started copying Nicole on emails that had always gone to Karen, emails about strategy, about client relationships, about things that were really none of a marketing coordinator's business. Then she began appearing in meetings that Karen used to run, not sitting in the back, but sitting at the table, and nobody said anything about it, because you do not say anything. You notice and you file it away, and you tell yourself maybe there is a reason. And then one day you look up and Karen is not coming into the office anymore, and Nicole is. And the shape of the thing becomes impossible to ignore, but by then it is already done. What Nicole did not know, what she genuinely could not have known in those early months while she was simply doing her job, and perhaps beginning to feel something she had not planned on feeling, is that David had not just chosen her as a romantic partner. He had chosen her as a replacement, a full structural replacement, not just for his marriage, but for everything Karen represented in his business and his life. He had looked at his situation the way a developer looks at a building he wants to repurpose, and decided that Karen was a tenant whose lease needed to end, and Nicole was the new vision for the space, and what that meant in practice. What it meant in the specific and methodical and coldly practical way that David Whitfield did everything that mattered to him, is that before he ever told Karen he wanted a divorce, before he ever sat across from her at that dining room table, before she ever found the folders and confronted him with what she knew, he had already been working for months on making sure that by the time she understood what was happening, there would be nothing left for her to claim. What David Whitfield did next was not a crime of passion. It was not the impulsive decision of a man who had fallen in love and lost his judgment. It was a business decision, cold and deliberate and carefully researched and executed with the same methodical patience that had made him successful in every other area of his professional life. And it began in the first quarter of 2017, a full 18 months before he ever asked Karen for a divorce. The restructuring started with the LLCs. It always starts with the LLCs because that is where the ownership lies. That is where the paper trail begins and ends. And David understood that if you move carefully enough through the corporate structure, each move justified by a plausible business reason, each change documented in the language of optimization and growth strategy, you can shift the weight of ownership from one person to another so gradually that by the time anyone tries to follow the trail, it looks like a series of reasonable decisions rather than a single deliberate act. He moved Karen's ownership stake from the primary LLC into a secondary holding company. She still had signing authority on paper. She was still technically present in the structure, but operationally, in the places where control actually lived, David had taken the wheel. And then he did it again 3 months later, a slightly different structure, and then again, and then a fourth time, each move individually defensible, each one a reasonable response to a real or invented business need. But laid end to end in sequence, they told a story that was unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Karen's name was moving, slowly, methodically, from the center of everything she had built toward the edge, and then beyond the edge, into a position where she was visible on paper but powerless in practice, present in name but absent in authority. In parallel, David was moving the personal assets. The joint investment account was rebalanced into an account in his name alone, justified as portfolio optimization. The vacation property in Hilton Head that they had bought together in 2014 was quietly listed for sale through a real estate firm in South Carolina that Karen had never heard of. The proceeds went into an account she did not have access to, and the life insurance policy that had named Karen as the primary beneficiary was modified to route payouts through a trust structure that David controlled and that Karen was not a party to. Each of these moves was wrapped carefully. In the language of routine financial management, each one standing alone was explainable, but the forensic consultant who later reviewed the complete paper trail said it most clearly. He said, "What struck me was not any single transaction. It was the sequence, the spacing, the architecture of it, the way each move created the legal and structural cover for the next one." This was not a man making financial decisions in response to circumstances. This was a man executing a plan he had constructed in advance. Someone had thought about this very carefully over a very long period of time. And that level of premeditation changes everything about how you have to think about what it was. Karen had been distracted in the spring of 2018, and David had known she would be, or perhaps had counted on it. Because in the spring of 2018 her mother suffered a severe stroke that left her requiring significant rehabilitation and ongoing care, and Karen, being the person who showed up always, without being asked, began making extended trips from Columbus to Dayton to manage her mother's care, coordinate with doctors, handle the financial and logistical dimensions of a serious family health crisis. And David had encouraged this enthusiastically, generously, in a way that Karen later described to her sister as suspiciously supportive. He told her, "Go. Take the time you need. I will handle things here. Do not worry about the office. Just be with your mother." And Karen had believed him because why would she not? Because for 17 years he had been her partner and she had trusted him with the things that mattered, and this was one of those things. And so she had gone, and David had stayed, and he had handled things, just not in any of the ways she would have wanted him to handle them. Karen came home from one of those Dayton trips in August of 2018 and felt immediately and viscerally that something was wrong. She could not name it at first. She described it to Susan as feeling like someone had rearranged the furniture while she was gone, not physically, but something in the texture of the space was different, something that she could feel but not yet see. And she started asking questions, careful professional questions, the kind that had served her well for 17 years, questions about the business accounts, about a quarterly statement she had not received, about a refinancing discussion she seemed to have been left out of, and David had answers for everything. Reasonable, calm, slightly annoyed answers. The kind of answers that are specifically engineered to make the person asking them feel like the problem is their own anxiety rather than the thing they are asking about. But Karen had spent 17 years reading financial documents and the people who created them, and she knew what a clean answer looked like, and she knew in the specific physical way that she knew everything about money when an answer had been constructed to sound clean rather than actually being clean, and something was wrong. She did not know yet how wrong, but she knew, and she began in the evenings after David was asleep, sitting alone at the kitchen table with her laptop and every document she could access remotely, to look. In October of 2018, after 3 consecutive nights of looking, Karen Whitfield found the restructured LLC. She found the insurance modification. She found the Hilton Head listing. She found the account rebalancing. She found 4 separate corporate restructuring moves that individually looked like routine business decisions and collectively looked like a carefully designed plan to move her out of her own company. She printed everything. She organized it by date. She color-coded it by account and entity type. She put it in 3 labeled folders and placed them in her briefcase. And the following evening, she placed those folders on the dining room table, made a pot of coffee, sat down, and waited for her husband to come home. David's response when he walked in and saw those folders on that table was not what she expected. He did not panic. He did not deny. He did not apologize. He sat down across from her, looked at what she had assembled, was quiet for a moment, and then told her he wanted a divorce and that she had no legal claim to what she believed she had built, that the business restructuring had been done properly, that the assets had been moved legally, and that her options at this point were limited. He said it calmly. The way you say something you have rehearsed, the way you say something you knew was coming because you had been the one planning it. And Karen sat across from him and said nothing. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She looked at her husband of 17 years and said nothing at all, because she was already thinking. She was already several steps ahead of this moment in the way she had always been several steps ahead of every moment that mattered. Susan told me. She called me that night, late. I picked up thinking something had happened to Mama, but it was Karen and her voice was completely calm, which frightened me more than anything else could have. She was so completely calm, and she said, Sue, he has been planning this for a long time. I just do not know yet exactly how long. And I said, Karen, what are you going to do? And she said, I need to figure out how long before I decide what to do next. And I did not fully understand what she meant by that until much later. Until I understood that Karen had already begun to think not just about what David had done, but about how to prove it. She was not reacting. She was already planning, because that is who Karen was. She did not react to things. She responded to them. And her responses were always thorough. Within 3 weeks of that conversation, Karen Whitfield left the house on Birchwood Drive. She took 2 suitcases, her laptop, her portable hard drive, and a small banker's box of personal documents she had kept in her home office. She drove herself to Dayton. She moved into her sister's spare room. And she told almost nobody where she was or what had happened. David told everyone who asked that she had decided to leave, that it was mutual, that they were handling it like adults. And most people believed him because most people always believed David. And because the story he told was familiar. It was the story of a marriage that had simply run its course. 2 busy people who had grown apart. It happens all the time. It was a believable story, a clean story, the kind of story that does not invite follow-up questions. And that was precisely why he chose it. What he did not tell anyone, what he did not yet understand himself, is that Karen had not left to get away. She had left to get ready. To the outside world, David Whitfield moved on with remarkable speed and remarkable comfort. By early 2019, less than 4 months after Karen had left, Nicole had moved into the house on Birchwood Drive. They were photographed together at a Columbus Urban League fundraiser in March. They appeared together at a Cincinnati commercial real estate conference in April. David gave a long profile interview to Columbus Business First in June in which he talked about his vision for Whitfield Property Group over the next decade. His tone was expansive, confident, forward-looking, the tone of a man who had just cleared a significant obstacle from his path and was now free to accelerate. He looked in every photograph and every interview like a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted, and in his understanding of the situation, that is precisely what he had done. But inside Whitfield Property Group, something had begun to go wrong in the way that things go wrong when a critical structural element is removed from a building. Not all at once. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow accumulation of small failures that individually seem manageable until they are suddenly not. The first visible sign came in April of 2019 when a refinancing deal on their flagship commercial property in the Short North District hit a wall at the bank. The documentation package David had submitted contained errors, not sophisticated errors, not complex judgment calls that reasonable professionals might disagree about, but basic technical errors of the kind that Karen would have caught in the first 10 minutes of reviewing the package. The kind of errors that revealed not a single mistake, but a systematic absence of the quality control that had made Whitfield Property Group's documentation reliable for 14 years. The loan officer flagged them, called David directly, and David had to spend 3 days correcting and resubmitting work that under Karen's oversight would never have gone out the door in that condition. The financial consultant who later reviewed the company's operational history told me, a sophisticated business has a nervous system, not a person, not a name on a door, but a set of systems and processes and standards that operate consistently regardless of what any individual is doing on any given day. And those systems do not build themselves. Someone designs them, someone maintains them, someone catches the errors before they leave the building. And when you remove that person, the systems do not immediately fail. They degrade, slowly and then faster, and the people inside the organization often cannot see it happening because they are too close to it. By the time it becomes undeniable, the damage is usually already significant. The second sign came that summer when the IRS opened a formal inquiry into the LLC restructuring from 2018. They had questions about how the equity transfers had been classified for tax purposes. The answer to those questions should have been straightforward if the filings had been done correctly. They had not been. David's new accountant, someone he had hired without consulting Karen and without the benefit of her institutional knowledge of the company's financial history, had filed the transition documentation in a way that created a liability that the original structures had been specifically designed to avoid. The exposure, according to the independent consultant brought in to assess, it was significant. And as I said, significant in accountant language means this is going to hurt in plain language. Karen's sister Susan had never for a single moment accepted David's version of what had happened. Not the day Karen left, not the week after, not the month after. 3 months had passed, and Susan had not received a phone call, not a text, not an email, not a forwarded address, nothing. And Susan, who had known Karen her entire life and who knew with the certainty of 40-some years of sisterhood that Karen Whitfield did not simply disappear from the people she loved without explanation, filed a welfare concern with Columbus police. She was told politely but firmly that Karen was an adult who had chosen to leave a marriage, that there were no signs of foul play, that adult voluntary departures were not a police matter, that there was nothing to investigate, and Susan said respectfully that she understood. And then she went home and hired a private investigator because Susan was in her own quieter way more like Karen than most people knew. She told me, "I was not worried about foul play in the way they meant it. I was not worried that David had done something physically. I knew Karen was somewhere safe. I knew she had left on her own terms because that is the only way Karen does anything. What I was worried about was what she had left behind and whether she had left it willingly. Whether she had been manipulated into walking away from things she had built and earned and was legally entitled to, because that felt much more like the David I knew than anything violent. David's way was always to make you give him what he wanted while believing it was your own idea. So I hired someone to look at the financial trail because that is where the truth was going to be. It was always going to be in the numbers." Susan's private investigator spent 2 weeks in January of 2020. Reviewing the publicly available and subpoenaed financial records of Whitfield Property Group and the Whitfield family's personal accounts, and what he found changed the entire shape of the story. Karen Whitfield had not been bought out, had not received a settlement, had not signed any agreement transferring her equity. She had been written out, her name had been moved, and then moved again, and then restructured out of the center of things so gradually and so carefully that from the outside, it looked like a series of routine business decisions made by a company that was simply evolving. But from the inside, it was unmistakably deliberate. And in the state of Ohio, the deliberate transfer of marital assets to defeat a spouse's equitable claim is not a personal matter. It is a legal one, and it carries serious consequences. Susan took the investigators' findings to a Columbus attorney named Patricia Voss, a woman who had spent 22 years in financial litigation and who had seen fraudulent conveyance cases in many forms. Voss reviewed the documentation package over a long weekend, and on Monday morning she made 2 phone calls, one to the Ohio Division of Securities and one to an IRS contact she had worked with on a previous case. And then she called Susan back and told her that what she was looking at was not a complicated divorce, it was a documented financial scheme. Textbook fraudulent conveyance executed with unusual patience and sophistication. Assets moved specifically and deliberately over an extended period of time to defeat a spouse's equitable claim. She had seen versions of it before, she said, but rarely constructed this carefully, rarely this architectural in its design. The person who built this, she told Susan, understood financial structures at a level that most people do not, and they had used that understanding to dismantle someone else's claim from the inside. By the spring of 2020, the investigation had expanded significantly. The Ohio Division of Securities was looking at the LLC restructuring. The IRS was already in the middle of its own inquiry. Patricia Voss had filed a civil complaint that brought in the Franklin County courts, and a Columbus television news station ran a short segment about a local real estate developer facing financial fraud allegations. David's name was now in a court filing. That was part of the public record. The story he had spent 2 years controlling had escaped his control, It was out in the world now, findable, citable, shareable, and the carefully maintained image of the unbothered successful man who had simply moved on from a mutual decision was beginning to develop cracks that no amount of tailored suits or charity gala appearances could paper over. And then came the development that nobody had anticipated, certainly not David. Nicole Reeves had been living inside David's version of events for 2 years. She had believed what he had told her, that Karen had received a fair settlement and chosen to leave, that the divorce had been handled properly. She had not been looking for evidence to the contrary, because she had had no reason to believe the contrary existed. And then one afternoon in early 2020, she was at his home office computer printing a document for a client presentation, and she saw a folder on the desktop she had not noticed before, and she opened it, not with any intention to investigate, simply because it was there and Karen's name was on it, and she was curious in the way that anyone would be curious. And what she found in that folder was a document that rewrote everything she thought she understood about the life she had moved into. The folder contained a typed memo with handwritten notes in the margins. It was dated in the first quarter of 2017. It was written by David, the handwriting was his, the voice was his, and it outlined in 4 numbered phases what he called a transition strategy for the business. Phase 1, secondary LLC formation. Phase 2, reclassify Karen's equity position. Phase 3, personal asset transfer. Phase 4, exit. Written out in the calm, organized language of a business plan, not a love letter, not an impulsive note, not the document of a man reacting to a crisis, but the document of a man who had been planning a specific outcome for a specific period of time before he ever gave any public indication that anything in his marriage was wrong, before he ever had the conversation at the dining room table, before he ever told Karen he wanted a divorce. The plan had existed in writing for over a year, and Nicole sat at that desk for a long time before she did anything, sat with the weight of what she was reading, sat with the understanding of what it meant not just about Karen but about herself, about what kind of man she had moved her life for. And then she picked up the phone and called Patricia Voss's office. Patricia Voss told me, when Nicole provided that document to our office, everything changed. The character of the entire case changed, because before that document we had strong circumstantial evidence of fraudulent conveyance. We had the paper trail, we had the timeline, we had the sequence of moves that looked deliberate, but we did not have David's own words describing the intent. And intent is everything in a case like this. Intent is the difference between aggressive financial management and a premeditated scheme. That document removed any possible ambiguity about intent. This was not a man who had made a series of individually defensible decisions in response to a marriage that was failing. This was a man who had decided on an outcome before the marriage was visibly failing and had spent over a year executing a documented plan to achieve it. That changes the legal theory entirely. That is what made the RICO argument viable, because that is what Karen and Patricia Voss filed. They did not file for divorce. They did not file a standard civil complaint about disputed marital assets. They filed a civil RICO claim, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, arguing that the LLC restructuring and the associated asset transfers constituted a fraudulent enterprise, an organized, premeditated, multi-step scheme designed specifically to deprive Karen of her legally protected marital assets. Civil RICO in a domestic financial case is unusual. It requires a high evidentiary threshold. Judges approach it carefully, but the evidentiary threshold in this case had been met, and then some. They had the paper trail. They had the expert testimony about the sophistication and deliberateness of the scheme. They had the memo in David's own handwriting describing 4 phases of a transition strategy dated 18 months before the divorce was ever discussed. And they had Nicole Reeves, who had provided the document voluntarily and who was prepared to testify about what she had found and how she had found it. And the Franklin County Court agreed that the claim had merit and allowed it to proceed. But before all of that, before the court filings and the RICO argument and Nicole's discovery, you need to understand where Karen actually was during those 14 months while David was polishing his image and the business was quietly degrading. Because she was not hiding. She was not recovering. She was not in the process of moving on. She was in her sister's spare room in Dayton at a folding table surrounded by legal pads and printed documents and 17 years of institutional memory that no one else on earth possessed. And she was building the most thorough and detailed financial case she had ever constructed which given her professional history is saying something significant, she told me. I knew that if I filed for divorce immediately, David's lawyers would bury the financial issues in the procedural complexity of the divorce itself. I had seen how he operated in business. He controls the narrative. He moves quickly. He sets the terms before the other side has had time to understand what the terms are, and I was not going to let that happen. So I waited. I documented everything I could access remotely. I reconstructed from memory the financial history of every entity I had personally built. I created a timeline of every asset I could identify and every move that had been made with it, and I waited for him to make a mistake he could not explain away, because people who are confident they have gotten away with something always make that mistake eventually. They relax, they get sloppy, they leave a folder open on a computer desktop. In February of 2021, 26 months after Karen Whitfield had walked out of the house on Birchwood Drive with 2 suitcases and a portable hard drive, a Franklin County judge awarded her a full restoration of her equity stake in Whitfield Property Group, damages totaling approximately $1.4 million, representing the value of the assets that had been fraudulently conveyed, and attorney's fees. Whitfield Property Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 6 weeks after the judgment. David Whitfield is currently appealing portions of the judgment. He has liquidated the majority of his personal assets to cover legal costs. The house on Birchwood Drive was sold at a significant loss in 2022. The magazine profiles and the charity gala photographs and the confident posture of the man who believed he had gotten away with something are gone. What remains is a man fighting in courtrooms over what is left of a life he dismantled himself by misidentifying the most important thing in it. Nicole Reeves cooperated fully with the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. She has since relocated to another city and started a small real estate consulting practice of her own. The people who know her say she seems lighter than she did before, as though she has put down something very heavy and is only now beginning to understand how much it had been weighing on her. Karen Whitfield used the proceeds of her court settlement to establish a financial consulting firm that specializes, and as I said, this is not a coincidence, in helping individuals identify and document marital asset fraud. She has taken the specific knowledge of exactly how it is done, knowledge she gained in the most personal and costly way imaginable, and she has turned it into something that protects other people from experiencing what she experienced. She told me, "People ask if I am angry, and the honest answer is not anymore. He gave me 19 years of building something, and then he handed me the blueprint for exactly how it could be taken apart, and I just used the same blueprint. That is the most Karen Whitfield sentence I have ever heard." David Whitfield did not lose because he was caught. He lost because he made a fundamental error in his assessment of the situation. He thought Karen was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a tenant whose lease needed to end. He thought she was a replaceable component in a structure he had built, and in that belief he revealed that he had never truly understood what she was. She was not a component. She was the foundation. She was the thing the entire structure rested on. And the moment he removed her, the whole thing had nowhere left to stand. It stood for a while on momentum and appearances and the considerable force of his personality. But foundations do not care about personality. They care about load-bearing capacity. And without Karen, the load was simply too much. He spent 14 months building a meticulous written plan to erase his wife from their shared life, and he never once in all of that time stopped to ask what she might be building in the silence he had created around her. He assumed the silence was emptiness. He assumed the absence was surrender. He assumed that the person who had never needed the credit would not need the justice either. He was wrong about all of it. The silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. And when it arrived in a Franklin County courtroom with 17 years of institutional memory and a forensic accountant's precision and a civil RICO filing and a memo in his own handwriting, it was unstoppable. Stories like this one raise questions that go far beyond one marriage and one courtroom in Columbus, Ohio. They make you think about the people in your own life who do the work quietly, the ones who never need the recognition, the ones who are the spine when everyone else is focused on the face. And they make you ask what it means when we fail to see those people, when we look at a successful thing and credit only the parts we can see, only the charm and the confidence and the name on the byline, and quietly forget or discount or simply stop seeing the architecture underneath, the systems and the structures, and the 17 years of steady, careful, competent work that made the whole thing possible. Because the David Whitefields of the world do not succeed in isolation. They do not become the face of something without someone building the something that the face belongs to. And when they forget that, when they start to believe the performance is the substance, that is when the whole thing starts to fail, slowly at first, and then all at once. So before you go, here is what I want to ask you. How early do you think Karen actually knew what David was planning? And do you think every single one of those 14 months of silence was intentional and strategic from the very beginning? Or do you think she needed all of that time to fully prepare? Drop your honest answer in the comments, because when you map the complete timeline, there is a question about exactly when Karen shifted from reacting to planning that this case never fully resolved, and I want to know what you think. If this story made you think, if it kept you watching, if it made you want to understand how something like this actually happens inside what looks like a normal and successful life, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. We cover real stories about real people and the moments where ordinary life crossed into something that nobody saw coming. Hit the like button if this story hit differently for you. Subscribe so you do not miss what we put out next, and share this with someone who you think needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones hiding in plain sight on streets that look exactly like Birchwood Drive. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.